Hi, this is Parth Chanda, founder and CEO of Lextegrity, and I have the privilege and honor to have with me today Chen, the former DOJ compliance expert. Welcome, Hui.
Thank you for having me, Parth.
Well, for all of those listeners out there who don't know your background, you started your career as an AUSA and a trial attorney at the DOJ, and then went on to many years as a compliance professional in-house at Microsoft, Pfizer, Standard Chartered, before becoming the DOJ's compliance expert. So you have a wealth of experience from various perspectives, and we're so excited you're here today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this is part one of our three-part fireside chat series with you on how digital transformation can drive compliance program effectiveness. We'll be focusing today on monitoring and auditing of spend data. In part two, we'll delve into digital transformation and third-party risk management. And part three, we'll focus on digital transformation and enabling better ethical decision-making by your business. So definitely check those out as well. So let's dive in. You've spoken about the need for companies to use data. Now, there are obviously many types of enterprise data that companies can access, from spend data, from financial systems, data from email and messaging platforms, HR data, sales data, training and investigations data, and on and on. I think we wanted to focus today on spend data, as that data is really, universal to nearly every industry and company, and systems like SAP, Concur, Oracle maintain fairly robust data points around spend that are at the same time relatively accessible and are already being analyzed within companies. So, and on top of that, given the fact that a lot of compliance issues, from bribery and corruption to fraud and conflicts of interest, pass through spend data systems, I wanted to dive into that data with you today. So Hui, my first question for you is, what are your general observations on where most compliance functions are today with respect to understanding their own spend data?
I would say, unfortunately, for the most part, they're not terribly sophisticated. So I think most companies are, certainly their compliance department, are not in the habit of monitoring and understanding the spend data. In fact, that's true with business data in general. So one time I was talking to a client who's a compliance person in the company, and she very proudly told me that she had built a system in her company that tracks all the third-party related information, from due diligence results to any investigations or red flags. And I said, that's wonderful. Now what you need to do is overlay that with the business data relating to the distributors that you have in the system. So let's say we were specifically talking about distributors. So I said, how about, what kind of money you have spent on these distributors in terms of marketing funds? How about how much money have these distributors revenue? How much have they brought in? All these basic business data. She said to me, we don't have that kind of information. I said, well, I know you don't, but the company does. She said, no, the company doesn't. I said, no, I'm sorry. Your company has to have this. You have to have it to run the business. And she insisted that the company would not have this information. So I found that incredible. So the next day I was meeting with their CFO. So I asked the CFO, do you have this kind of information on your distributors? He says, of course we do. We couldn't do business without it. So he shows it, right to me, right in front of him as we were talking, the system that they had tracking all these business data relating to their distributors. And I felt like saying to him, can I introduce you to your compliance colleague downstairs? Because they don't seem to have ever met. So that really was just very shocking to me, that the utter lack of understanding of even what kind of business data exists in the company.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and then, sort of a related point. I mean, you talk a lot about data analytics, not just being, in that case, the person wasn't even aware that they had access to the numbers. But then, the next step that you talk about is, taking those numbers and then actually analyzing the data. So can you talk a little bit more about the meaning of that distinction for you, the sort of numbers versus the actual analysis of the numbers?
Right. So data analytics, to me, someone I am not trained as a data analyst. I nearly flunked my statistics course in college. It was, in fact, my lowest grade. So I am not someone who's like a math person or a stats person. And I can appreciate data. Why? Because it's actually not about numbers to me. It's about trends, patterns, and outliers. So you take a set of data like the number of investigations. So most compliance departments have that kind of number. How many investigations did we open? How many did we close? How many are in which countries? Whatnot. But just looking at those raw numbers really doesn't tell you very much. So yeah, so you have these, distribution of all these cases among different countries, and having a low number in a market, low number of cases, is that good or bad? Well, you don't know that. The number itself doesn't tell you that. You really have to put that in context with other data, with the number in other countries, as well as what else is going on in the country. So let's say you have a low, you have almost no cases in a country that with all the, whether it's CPI index or it's HR issues, that you should be expecting a lot of numbers, but you're not getting those investigations, then that's not necessarily good. So it's about making sense of those numbers as opposed to just looking at those numbers by themselves. The same thing with, if you look at, the many companies, or at least at some level, do some that, top 10 or top 20 of different spend categories, for example. It's not about just looking at the top 20. It's about looking at, do those top 20 make sense? Is there someone in the top 20 that you didn't expect to be in the top 20, or someone who should be in the top 20 who's not there? It's about contextualizing all of those numbers.
Yeah, no, that resonates a lot with me. I mean, that tracks exactly my experience, as an in-house compliance lawyer for many years, and then also, really from speaking with literally hundreds of companies since we launched Lextegrity. I think, there's really, unfortunately, still over-reliance and emphasis on what you just described, sort of those raw data points or the KPIs. Top 20 is a great example of really anything. It could be top 20 T&E spenders. That's something that people focus on, compliance teams focus on, internal audit focuses on. But often, that may just confirm that the CEO has the highest T&E every month. So it may not be very illuminating from, it may be pretty obvious. And, comparing someone's T&E in New York City to a lower cost location may also be highly inaccurate. And so you see the same thing as you mentioned on the third party side, top 20 high risk third parties and their largest transactions, as high risk is identified through the due diligence process, let's say, and what you miss there is that you may have many quote unquote low risk third parties that were misidentified, either purposefully or not, on the front end, or that are ultimately your conduits for impropriety. Or you may have high risk third parties from the diligence process that have all sorts of controls and mitigation in place that make them actually quite low risk, and it's a medium risk third party that maybe doesn't have those controls. So from my perspective, that's where compliance teams need to move, taking those sort of inputs, the raw data, and actually applying true analytics. And what we think about from our standpoint is far more sophistication, using the types of tests that forensic accountants use, fraud analytic tests, layering tests, applying statistical outlier detection and things like that, to really move away from these sort of top 20 to more accurate and more predictive data analytics. But I think on a related note, I think what our job as sort of more experts in this area is really to demystify some of this. And I think one of the things I want to ask you about is this: what I see sometimes among in-house teams is this sort of paralysis when thinking about data analytics, like this idea that we're going to open up as a compliance team or an audit team a Pandora's box of things to follow up on when we apply data analytics to our spend data, and then we're going to be inundated with potentially problematic transactions, and we're not going to have the resources to follow up. So, putting yourself in the shoes, back in the shoes of an in-house, lawyer, how would you think about this, or how would you advise an in-house lawyer to think about that when making this decision on whether or not to move forward with more sophisticated data analytics?
So it's very funny that you say that, because I do hear that a lot from in-house lawyers saying, "Oh my goodness, if we start doing this, then we're gonna have to follow up because we're gonna learn things." Well, I don't know how that attitude really different than plugging your fingers in your ears and going la la la. Because what's there is there. And what you also don't realize is, and this is something that when I was at the DOJ, I certainly spoke with the prosecutors a lot about, was don't even ask for, let's say their investigative records, because more often than not, those records would be privileged. Just go ahead and ask for data. Data is not privileged. Anybody could ask for data. You can ask for data for all kinds of things, and there is no way a company can claim data as privileged. So, do you really want to wait until law enforcement comes in and dive into your data and tell you things that you had access to 5 years ago and did nothing with? That would be a much worse story to tell. So to me, that the sort of fear of, my goodness, opening a Pandora's box, better you open it than someone else open it and then turn around to you and say, you know what, you could have opened this Pandora box 3 years ago and dealt with it, and instead you have let it sit there and fester, and now it's a much worse problem because for 3 years you just purposely ignored having this data and doing anything with it. So I think that's my response to this fear.
Yeah, no, that's definitely persuasive from my perspective. But I guess on a related note, how do you respond to then the in-house counsel who hears that message from you and then asks, are they going to be, now understanding that, the DOJ, SEC, the CGU, or whomever is actually going to ask for this data, and is also going to be looking for this data, that they could potentially end up in a worse place, even if they, are putting something like this in place, a worse place if the data analytics expose issues, and they then need to explain that to enforcement authorities, and that the enforcement authorities are then going to second guess, what they did with that analysis, with the data analytics that they had before them. How do you respond to that? Because I could see that being sort of the natural response to the point you just raised.
Well, the second guessing is going to happen. So the question is, what will they be second guessing? So if you do nothing, the second guessing is really pretty easy by law enforcement. There's no guessing. You did nothing. So whereas if you had done something and they're second guessing your decision, that's a much better place than having done nothing. So in one scenario, you've had the data and you've done nothing, and you have allowed the problem to fester. The second case scenario is you've had the data, you've tried to do something that really wasn't, in their opinion, in their second guessing, not the best thing you could have done, but at least you did it. So this is really the same kind of scenario as you might see in a situation with, let's say, third-party due diligence. Is it better? So, if the best case scenario is that you conduct due diligence, you find red flags, you effectively remediate the red flags, and it's, then there's, then everything's good. However, the only scenario where this ends up in a bad place in front of law enforcement is, whatever you did to remediate was not sufficient, right? So in that scenario, is it better to say we never did any due diligence at all? Or to say we did due diligence, we tried to remediate, maybe we didn't do as well as we could have, but we certainly, we gave it our best shot, as opposed to we did nothing. So compare the two bad scenarios. I think what's obviously better is having at least being able to demonstrate that you have done something.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I think partly what I've seen now, talking to other peers, is there are sort of some misconceptions around implementation as well. I think thinking about how we're going to actually implement this, that the idea that data analytics are difficult, that it needs, you need a background in math, you need advanced AI, AI, machine learning, that's really the vogue right now, or you have to hire a team of internal data scientists to manage all that, or that all these platforms have to cost you millions of dollars to implement, and only a few companies in the world know how to do it. All of these misconceptions, I think, also cause paralysis. I think from my perspective, these tools are not science fiction. I mean, they're being used today. They're by many companies. They're not the province of the biggest companies in the world. They exist today out of the box. You can apply sophisticated risk algorithms to root out corruption, fraud, sanctions, embezzlement, all sorts of high risk problems today. But I think that idea that it's very hard to implement, and then on top of that, related to your earlier point, the idea that once it's implemented, you're sort of at the whim of a machine and you have no say over what this machine spits out for you. That's also another big misconception I see. A good data analytics platform should be, right size for your industry, your business, your risks, and allow you to control your analytics and really give you aggregate analyses and give you really an operationalized way to actually use your data. So I think that's another thing that I see is an area for more education. So yeah, I mean, I think when I recently hear the DOJ and SEC saying that they're getting to a place where they're going to look at companies not using data analytics as the outlier rather than the norm, I do feel like regulator expectations are always changing. I started as an FCPA lawyer back in 2004, and there was only then were they starting talking about third-party due diligence, and then companies responded to it. Do you feel like you mentioned the DOJ and SEC doing data analytics. Do you feel like we're at the same juncture today around data analytics where the expectations are again like outpacing how companies are reacting, and compliance teams are again sort of on their back foot dealing with regulators? Or do you think
absolutely. So I mean, to begin with, so they don't, the law enforcement and as well as regulators, they don't sit in caves. They're out there and they see what's going on. They have seen platforms like yours. They have, they go to academic conferences and they see the latest research. They're also, they're also doing data analytics themselves. And I think the fundamental question that I have advised prosecutors certainly to think about is, does this company that you're prosecuting, whose compliance program you're evaluating as part of your prosecution, do they use data analytics in how they do business, right? So if you have a company that's really sophisticated in data analytics, or even just average sophisticated, and they say, so this, you can think about, raise your own example, Facebook, Google, and any kind of company. I can hardly think of sort of major companies today that doesn't use data analytics. That they all use. I mean, the gambling, the casino industry have been using using data analytics for marketing for probably 2-3 decades now. So to say that we use this tool to make money, but we don't use this tool to sort of prevent wrongdoing, sounds to me like a terribly irresponsible way to do your compliance, because you can't say I don't know how to do it, because your company does know how to do it. So this really has to be commensurate with, does your company do this at all? So not your compliance department, but does the company do it? So if a small mom and pop bakery is saying that we're not using data analytics, yeah, I could see that. They probably don't need it for a storefront business selling bread and pastry. But they probably even use data analytics. So however they're using data analytics to market their business, I expect them to use the same level of sophistication to certainly manage their money. So if you apply that to large companies, I don't think any large company or even medium-sized company's marketing department is not doing data analytics these days. So if they're using it in any part of their business as a instrument for them to be better at their business, then why can't they use it in compliance? There is no reason other than not willing to do it.
Yeah.
It's not we can't, but it's we won't.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And then even taking the flip side of that, which we'll touch on in part 3 of our discussion, is sort of how you as a compliance organization can give your business better tools. Really sort of the flip side of that, you're talking about how the regulators are going to think about this, but how does your business also think about it, this not having access to this data from a compliance perspective when they have an access to a wealth of other commercial data and dashboards. Really just going back to your distributor example, where the CFO can pull up on his iPad distributor margin data, but the compliance organization tells him that that's not possible, and they can't give them any risk analysis of that data. So it's sort of the flip side of that. And it's really another way to get ahead of this, not just with regulators, but to get ahead of the curve with your business, and make it seem like, and not make it just seem like, but really have a cutting edge program that's on par with their marketing analytics program or whatever. So, no, I think that's a really, trenchant point. So yeah, I mean, I think that's my parting thought on this is I think there's a lot of mystique around data analytics, a lot of misconceptions. I think, there's a lot of sense that there's, budgetary challenges, there's internal buy-in challenges, that, you have to wait for a big issue to turn this on. And if you turn it on, it's going to be very challenging. And I think, really, you don't have to also do a big bang. You can start with pilots, you can do things like that, but these things are available today off the shelf, and really can transform risk management overnight by unlocking all of this dormant data that's sitting in your organization that compliance organization is not using. So that would just be my parting thought for compliance professionals out there. But I'd love any sort of parting thoughts that you might have for for our listeners out there.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of points that you mentioned from the budget and buy-in perspectives. So I one of the stories that I remember very clearly from my time at the fraud section was that I had this. So this is not even just compliance, department person. This was a monitor. A corporate monitor comes in to present his latest findings on a company, and there was some issue related to the use of corporate credit cards in that particular company. So the monitor's recommendation was that train all employees, it literally said there, train all employees on the use of corporate credit card. So I saw that recommendation, I saw the description of the problem. I said, how many people in this company have corporate credit cards? It was a couple hundred people. He was going to train tens and thousands of people for something that 200 people have.
Yeah.
Talk about a waste. Talk about utter waste of money and time and resource, not to mention the credibility of the compliance department, in this case, the credibility of the monitor. That was a simple data point. You have a problem with the present corporate credit card? Start with how many people have them. And what kind of problem do you have? It's probably a subset of the 200 people. It's a subset of certain types of transactions. So if you dive into that data, that would have saved them so much. I mean, we're talking, this is not a small investment in training for tens and thousands of people. Even if it's, you do it for free, it's that many people's work hours. Think about the salaries wasted on that. So that's one. But so on the budget side, I think it's more expensive when you don't use data and end up spending a lot of time and resource chasing things that don't matter, chasing things that are not your real risks, and losing your sight on the real risk because you're not looking at the data. I think those are serious problems when you don't use data. So that's going to end up being much, much more costly. Secondly, from the buy-in perspective, I think compliance has got to be one of the last departments in the corporate world that does not use data analytics. So it's not just marketing. Finance, of course, uses it. Marketing uses it. Business, use it all the time because they have to analyze their revenue. They have to analyze why they're not meeting their revenue or why they're exceeding it. So everybody's looking at data except a couple of departments, compliance being one of them. That is not the way to get respect from your peers when you don't speak their language. Everybody comes to the table with their requests or strategies backed up by data. Compliance is the one that goes in without any of that and says, well, if you don't give me this, the regulators might come to get you. So we're selling ourselves as insurance policy in case regulator or law enforcement comes. and not a very effective insurance policy, because we can't even prove our value. You can't really say, if you invest this much in me, then you won't, then you won't get fined. So you can't bring, without data, you're really just bringing your gut feeling to the table. And that's not a very effective way to get buy-in, to get respect from your peers, and to get a place at the table. So that's where I would, that's where I would urge compliance professionals to really think about how you're using data, and are you really speaking, the language of your your colleagues, and are you being judicious in your use of resources, including your own resources?
Yeah, no, that is definitely, those are great points. And also, one exercise that I've advised companies in the past is really just taking, mapping and taking account, go to your first point that you raised, taking account of what those processes are today. Because when you think about, everyone thinks about data analytics as potentially being incremental effort, incremental spend on top of what's currently happening, but often what's currently happening, to your point, is not efficient, it's not effective, and you're often looking at the wrong things and spending a lot of time looking in the wrong places and doing it very manually. So, one example is you've got teams sometimes in organizations whose responsibility is to pretty much look at paperwork to make sure, compliance forms are answered appropriately and there's not a missing question here or there, and writing up findings based on those like small clerical errors, where, you can redeploy some of those people to be looking at real fraud analytics on spend data, where the real risk is, finding, potential real anomalies and real systemic issues. And similarly, from an internal audit perspective, there are opportunities to redeploy some of your, periodic auditing resources to be more continuous monitoring resources. And, so it does, I think if you take account as a first step in terms of how you're using resources, there are often ways to squeeze a lot of efficiency gains if you apply more data. So no, agree with you fully on those, both of those points. So Hui, thank you so much for your insights. They're, as always, extremely helpful to me. And I think to all our listeners out there looking to really transform their programs. Everyone out there, please make sure to tune into parts 2 and 3 of this chat series on digital transformation and compliance program effectiveness. The next part dealing with third-party risk management, and the third part dealing with enabling better decision-making ethically by your business. So thanks again, Hui.
Thank you.